Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 13 today and complete the chapter as Absalom has invited all of his siblings, all of the king's sons, to sheep shearing, and what could go wrong there? So as we've been doing, we've been looking at the parallels on this section between the two chapters, 2 Samuel 13 and 14, which you can see on the right side of the screen. Relevant for what we're doing right now is this Absalom aftermath. So after the Amnon rape scene with Tamar there, then there's Absalom aftermath, which we looked at last video and now today. And then at the end of chapter 14, after Joab and the woman of Tekoa have their conversation and then she comes back to David, Absalom again returns. So really, this is all about Absalom, and it's setting up what we'll be seeing in the following chapters from 2 Samuel 15 to 19, where it's all about Absalom. And one of the elements we're going to see again is Jonadab, who appeared as the friend or companion of Amnon, who advised him what to do about his lust for Tamar, now suddenly is going to be advising David. And as we prepare to look at that, we might ask, where's Joab? Where's Nathan? Joab will appear in the very first verse after the end of this scene and obviously knows exactly what's going on and will be there throughout, all the way to the end, until finally Solomon will have him killed. But Jonadab is nobody. He's not part of David's house. He's a friend of Amnon, and of that generation, he's David's nephew, as you can see on the left side of the screen, repeated as we heard from earlier, from 13:3, the son of David's brother Shemaiah, who we never hear anything about. So there's something very suspicious there, and it's setting up the fact that we'll see throughout the issue of Absalom's rebellion and David's strategy a whole series of other counselors and related people who show up. And again, no Nathan throughout the whole thing. Nathan we won't see again until the succession story and the beginning of 1 Kings and the question whether Adonijah or Solomon will be the successor. So who are all these other people? Why have we not heard of them before? And what's their relationship with each other is one of the things we're going to have to look at here. And we also note just thematically, there's almost nothing about Yahweh anywhere in here. This is not in our traditional sense religious at all, although it is in the biblical sense, because what's at issue is the holiness or the divine authority of the monarchy. And what we're seeing here, whether it's Yahweh who has cast all this badness on David in response to what he did with Bathsheba and Uriah, or whether it's David's strategy of how to get the succession turned out, all of it is under the guise of Yahweh. So even if Yahweh isn't present and the characters are not appealing to Yahweh or talking about Yahweh even much, that doesn't mean it's not still a religious text. So we'll keep that in mind as we look at what seemed like a secular political story. We can also have been looking at the echoes here in both chapters with Genesis. In our immediate scene here, we see down here that David will grieve the apparent but not true death of his sons by tearing his garment, as Jacob did the same thing about the apparent but not true death of Joseph at the hands of his sons. And so it notes also in both cases there's a question of the death of a son at the hand of other sons, although Jacob doesn't know that. David will certainly know that Absalom is responsible for the death of Amnon. And in both situations, although in a different context, they will flee. Jacob flees from his father's house when his brother Esau is consoling himself by planning to kill his brother after Jacob stole the fatherly blessing there. But this is different. Absalom flees here in the immediate situation. And we'll see it forms a tight little chiasm around his fleeing, which is repeated twice in this scene and once in the previous scene. So three times they're fleeing. Twice Absalom flees, and one time his brothers flee. And then finally at the end we'll see David is consoled, although the translation of verse 39 is very difficult, and we'll look at that more closely. And it's parallel to Isaac being consoled after the death of his mother Sarah, and Judah consoled after the death of his wife Shua. And those two cases are the only use of the verb nachem in the nifal stem, which is one of the various ways that Hebrew verbs can be styled. And so that makes it especially unusual. It's only in those two places outside of Samuel. So plainly that's part of the ongoing connection we've been seeing here. And in terms of our shape of our passage, we've been looking at how this unit here from 1323 to 39 forms this tight chiasm here, framed around the 2 full years at the beginning, the 3 years at the end, and then the meeting between Absalom and the king regarding the king's son, and Joab and the king regarding the king's sons. And at the center is where we're going to start now. Actually, we're starting on this verse here about the report of the killing. And then we'll see there's a couple of little chiasms within here, really highlighting the intimacy and the self-contained elements of the little subunits, and we'll look at that more as we go. And finally, this is part of the larger issue fratricide in the books of Samuel in the house of Saul and David. I won't go over all of this now. It's posted at radicalbible.net like all these other things. But we can see that it's been a theme throughout. Not just murder, but brotherly murder. And at one level, all murders of men by other men are brotherly murders given Genesis. But as I'm noting, Genesis is coming after as a reflection on the monarchy story, not earlier, so that the authors of the monarchy story can refer to Genesis, or the audience can know about Genesis. So we saw the ritual killing at the beginning of 2 Samuel of the people of Saul and the people of David there, and then Benjamite against Benjaminite in chapter 4 around Saul's son. We see what we see here around Absalom's revenge, and then later we'll see it coming back when the rebellious Absalom is killed by Joab, and then Joab will be killed and comes all back around. And then finally the assassination of Joab and Solomon's brother Adonijah. So fratricide throughout, and that's highlighting Genesis' argument that fratricide at the beginning, that Cain and Abel is the original sin. There is no sin in the garden story. The word chatat, the Hebrew word for sin, is never mentioned in the garden story. It's only mentioned in relation to Cain. And that should be fitting because the story we'll see in chapter 14, although doesn't echo Cain and Abel for the reason I just said, that Genesis came later, certainly the Genesis story of Cain and Abel is echoing the story that either Joab puts in the mouth of the woman of Tekoa or that she's spontaneously offering. We don't know whether she's accurate to his words, but we'll look at that next video. So with that in mind, let's look at the shape and we'll enter right into our story here in verse 30. So the narrator provides an omniscient perspective here, but as we'll see, Jonadab knows more than we might think he does too. So let's listen first to the narrator. So while they were on their way, and just to remind us where we were, this is where all the king's sons rose, each mounted the mule and fled after Absalom's servants had killed Amnon. So while they're on their way, presumably they're on their way back to Jerusalem because that's where they're going to arrive in just a couple of verses, although it's a good distance, and we looked at the map last time. The report came to David. The word for report here, hashemua here, and we've seen it a couple of times, but as my note below has, this false report is the first message. It isn't trustworthy. Does it put the others in doubt? And as you can see from my text quotes below from Brew Halpern, the text proclaims its own subtlety by exposing the mechanics of rumor. This begins with the rumor misconstruing Absalom's murder of Amnon as an attempt at revolution. And yet, the exaggeration in the rumor was prescient. Absalom would indeed turn on David personally rather than merely exacting revenge from Amnon. And we'll see further examples of this in Hushai in chapter 17. Halpern continues, this is exactly the overreaction on which the writer of 2 Samuel 8 depends in recounting the litany of David's accomplishments. Where we look there, and Halpern helped us to see that the text really doesn't say that David did that much, but we sort of run over that and assume it's saying more than it did, and overreact to assume that David is much more powerful than the text is actually saying. And similarly, it's suggesting that Absalom was more powerful in a violent way than the text will actually say. But we'll take Jonadab to correct the misperception, as we'll see. So the report came to David. We don't know who that report came to David via. That would be very interesting because it's somebody who had to have been there and came down. Is it Jonadab? Did he plot the false rumor so that he could then have an occasion to go to the king and refute the rumor? Perhaps. Who else might it have been? We don't know. But whatever it is, gets there before all the king's sons who are riding a mule, and that would presumably make them faster than walkers. And there's no other way to get back to Jerusalem from Baal Hazor, so we just don't know who that is, but that would be interesting to know, and the text doesn't tell us. So that came that Absalom had killed all the king's sons, and of course he didn't personally kill any of them, but not one of them was left. And that would, of course, include Solomon and all the others. So the king rose, tore his garments, again matching Tamar earlier, and also matching Jacob in Genesis, and lay on the ground, which doesn't match anything here. That's an extreme expression of grieving there. And all his servants who were standing by tore their garments, obviously in solidarity with their king. And the word for garments there, beged, the standard word for clothes that we've seen a number of times. And we'll see again next in the beginning of chapter 14, and then at the framing of the Absalom story at the end. And this is where we get to the mysterious appearance of Jonadab here. And as Hill notes, cited by Bodner, encountering the false report, Jonadab betrayed his complete knowledge of the ambush in Baal Hazor, including the participants in the crime, since he confirmed that, quote, they, the servants of Absalom, killed only Amnon. And so that's led Hill and others to suggest maybe Jonadab's been on Absalom's side all along. Maybe he set up the Amnon-Tamar situation, figuring that Absalom was a better patron to be attached to than the hot-headed Amnon, although Absalom has a temper as well. But at least as we know, he can bide his time. He's been 2 whole years waiting to revenge the death or the rape of his sister, and he'll have more patience than that. But here's Jonadab again. And again, as echoing what we saw in 13:3 at the beginning of this video, reminding us that he's David's nephew. Which is a very unusual situation. In terms of the cultural context of the time, the idea that somebody would listen for advice to someone a generation below them is just completely absurd. Men would not listen to women's advice unless they had to for some reason, and that's the conceit in the next chapter, that David will listen to the wise woman of Tekoa, although he'll rightly suspect that Joab was behind it, as he'll say to her directly. But when David, the younger brother, dared to talk to his older brothers at the scene of Goliath, they chastised him for even being there and talking at all. So the idea that the king, especially the king, not just somebody's uncle, but the king would get advice and listen to it from his nephew is completely absurd, and yet here it is. But where's Joab? We'll see Joab, as I noted, at the beginning in 14:1, but where is he now? And where's Nathan? Those are mysteries the text doesn't address, but I think it's important for us to raise them so we can see the selective telling that's here, as well as the unanswered questions about where David's other trusted advisors are when this is all going on. So Jonadab says, "Let not my lord suppose," which is what he assumes they'd suppose based on the report, which means not only does Jonadab know what happened, but he knows the report is there, which of course is obvious if he's looking to see them tearing their garments and the king lying on the ground. But he's ready for this. And how he got into the king's chamber, or wherever this is, he's apparently on the ground, so he's not in his chamber, we don't know. "Let not my lord suppose that they have killed all the young men, the king's sons." That's not a typo or a technical error there. That's what it says in the Hebrew. The Na'arim, the young men who are the king's sons. And the they here obscures Absalom's role. It is a they. It was the servants of Absalom. But he doesn't say that. He doesn't mention Absalom at all in that first sentence. Notice the king's sons, again, not his brothers or not your sons, but the king's sons. And note the little chiasm that this frames here. Amnon alone is dead, and Amnon alone is dead, and they do not take it to heart, which has an irony as well, as we'll see in just a moment. So Amnon alone is dead. The word for alone, bod here, not English bad, but Hebrew bod, highlights Amnon's isolation from the other royal sons and is repeated in the next verse, as we can see here. Unlike with Uriah, there's no collateral damage to obscure the murder. If we recall from chapter 12 from Joab's report back to David, that although David had said put Uriah out in the front and let him die, Joab realized that would make David's plan more obvious, that Uriah was being assassinated, so he put Uriah among other soldiers and is willing to sacrifice other soldiers to carry out the king's will. But here Amnon alone is dead. And then we hear, but Absalom fled. A question could be, is that still part of Jonadab's speech? The quotation marks are not in the original Hebrew, which has no punctuation at all. So, but Absalom fled could easily be part of Jonadab's speech rather than the narrator's intervention here. Plainly, what follows here is the narrator, but it's unclear exactly what's going on there. And note how this creates a separate little chiasm. Notice the two little chiasms, the Absalom or the Amnon alone is dead chiasm that we see right here, and then the second one that we see here in verses 34 to 37, framing around Absalom fled, which you can see the second one here, the people coming, the king's sons arriving, and the king's sons have come. So these two short chiasms here, first the one where Jonadab speaks, and notice that David had nothing to say, and then the narrator's intervention here, and I'll scroll down so we can see the rest of our next scene here, where Jonadab speaks to the king again, and again the king will have nothing to say, and it'll be framed around Absalom fled and Absalom fled. So Absalom fled there, as we just noted, and when the young man who kept watch, we don't know who that is in particular. Is that the same person who brought the bad report? We don't know. But when this young man who kept watch, using the word Hatzopheh here, which we'll see again in chapter 18 around keeping watch for Absalom, we'll see it 4 times there, so framing the whole Absalom story. So when he kept watch looked up, he saw many people coming from the Horonaim road, and the RSV omits Gehenna, behold, as it always does, but it's once in each of these 3 verses, omitted 3 times, really hiding the dramatic scene that's unfolding here as the other sons arrive and the king recognizes that he was mourning people who are not yet dead. He saw many people come from the Horonaim road. It's only here in the Deuteromistic history, and it's otherwise in Isaiah, Jeremiah a couple times, and all those are related to destruction along the Horonaim road. Will the audience recognize that echo? It's unclear. Jeremiah is a exilic, just almost exilic, an exilic text, and our text is probably earlier than that, but it's certainly associated with it there. So they're coming up this road by the side of the mountain, which is Mount Zion, that Jerusalem is on, and Jonadab speaks again. And as Bodner notes, it's almost as though he is keeping his options open and remaining a free agent, searching for the best patron. So as I was saying in the beginning, he seemed to be was said to be the companion or advisor for Amnon. Maybe he was really the advisor for Absalom all along, and Absalom planted him amongst Amnon to get Amnon killed. Perhaps Absalom was setting up the rape of his own sister to get Amnon killed so that he would have a path to the succession. That seemed unlikely that Absalom would be so cynical as to get his own sister raped, although I already proposed the possibility that David would allow Tamar's rape, and the possibility that Tamar is not actually David's daughter, although the text says that she's Amnon's sister. So we don't know to the extent that Absalom is willing to be deceitful and violent. We'll find out more as we go. So Jonadab again speaks to the king and says, "Behold, the king's sons have come. As your servant said, so it has come about." There seems to be nothing important here except to have Jonadab establish before the king his own credentials as a reliable reporter, to tell him what's happening, as if he's setting him up for further advice, although we will not hear from Jonadab again. And note again, David has nothing to say to Jonadab. Is he even listening? We don't know. As soon as he had finished speaking, so virtually this is simultaneously, the king's sons arrived, again with the behold. And so really, his words are irrelevant here, other than to say, "See, I told you so," because the king can see for himself everything that Jonadab just said. So Jonadab's certainly self-interested, but where his self-interest lies, we don't know, and we won't find out, because again, we don't hear from him again. So the king's sons arrived and raised their voices and wept, and the king and all his servants wept very bitterly, literally in the Hebrew, wept a great weeping. And we see the various weepings in 2 Samuel and 1 Samuel. I posted this chart earlier on radicalbible.net, so I won't post it again here. You can find it there. But we see how often weeping over deaths is a common element in these stories. So they were tearing their garments over what they thought were dead sons, and now that they're back, they're weeping over the live sons. And bitterly really doesn't seem to convey it, because why would they be bitter now they find out they're actually all alive? So it's certainly a weeping of joy here, not a bitter weeping. But again, Absalom fled, and one of my questions is, did he bring Tamar with him? We saw that Tamar had been in Absalom's house, not in her father's house, where she'd otherwise belonged, for all this time. We don't hear anything more about her in the story at all. So did he abandon her? To whom, we don't know. To his servants in his house? We hear nothing more about Tamar. And who he fled to is really important here, and the text gives us a substantial amount of information. So let's look at that. He went to Talmai, who we heard earlier in chapter 3:3. Let's go back to that in the beginning. Just in the obscure list of David's children and wives, we heard that the third, Absalom, son of Maacah, his mother, daughter of King Talmai. So Talmai is his grandfather, and in our immediate scene, we see the great-grandfather went to Talmai, son of Ahimud here, king of Geshur. Is Ahimud the king before Talmai? That would make sense, that Talmai has inherited the monarchy from his father. And we could see on the map here where Geshur is, on this map, down to Jerusalem here. But we can also look on Google Maps to see where it is currently, and we see it's a 2-day journey. So he's a good ways away, and this is clearly out of the territory of David. So David knows this. Joab certainly knows this. He's going to go fetch him from there, and yet David does nothing. And he can certainly imagine that his going to his grandfather's home in a place that could certainly be seen as a rivalry, or at least not under David's control from way down here in Jerusalem, could be Absalom mounting some kind of rebellion. and yet David does nothing. And again, the character question we have to address throughout all of this section is David suddenly gone from the astute leader who outsmarted Saul and even outsmarted the Philistines when they were suspicious of him, and who's suddenly just gone blank and unaware, or has he continued to be the aware person, playing it so close that readers don't even notice that this is perhaps part of David's whole plan? Again, we'll have to decide that as we continue to unfold the story. So he goes to him, and David mourned for his son day after day. As Falkman notes below, David is now lost and sedged in between the Absalom lines. And it's not clear which son. Is he mourning for Amnon, who's dead, or Absalom, who fled? And we don't know that yet. But verse 39 will tell us something more, although the translations are challenging, as we'll see just now. So reminding us, in case we missed it, Absalom having fled to Geshur. Notice it doesn't say he fled to Talmai. It's highlighting Geshur as the place there. And he stayed there 3 years. And as Borgen notes below, what is going on? I know what is going on in Israel in this time, and he says, quote, "Is David being incriminated as a distracted ruler? As something is terribly amiss here is indicated by the episode's initial confusion of message." And I've been noting that all along here. So is it confusion or is it intentional distraction? And again, we have to decide that. And so now we get to this final difficult verse. The New English translation follows a Qumran version here, which has Ruach HaMelech, the spirit of the king, rather than the Masoretic text, David the king. And that's what we hear here, translating spirit as heart. So the spirit of the king went out, and yet this is the question. New RSV has yearning for Absalom, for he was now consoled over the death of Amnon. But as Falkman notes, he argues against this, or longed, for the meaning of the verb here, latse, as not fitting the context. And he quotes Jongling in a text not published at the time, saying, David longed intensely to march out against Absalom, for he was grieved about Amnon, that he was dead. Joab, now the son of Dariah, discerned that the king was ill-disposed toward Absalom, which is the next verse. He goes on to suggest, hence march out against Absalom. Quote, Joab, however, decides on an intervention other than military means. As Bodner adds, the most probable explanation is a military one. Joab understands that the king's mind is against Absalom. Joab must suspect that Amnon's death was not only in revenge of Tamar, but has another angle as well. And following Bodner, I ended up translating it this way, as you can see. And King David put an end to marching forth against Absalom, for he was consoled over Amnon since he was dead. And so that's where that ends. And then Joab will come up with his own strategy, and we'll see how that parallels Nathan's strategy in chapter 12, but with a different outcome. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.